There are films that entertain you, and then there are films that seem to carry an entire world inside them. Worlds built from secrets, accidents, and ambitions that most audiences never suspect. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is one of those films. On the surface, it presents itself as a cheerful, colorful musical about a singing inventor, a magical car, and a family swept into adventure. But underneath that bright exterior lies a production story every bit as wild and surprising as anything that appears on screen. The real history of how this film came to exist, how it was made, and what it had become in the decades, since it's the kind of story that makes you look at familiar images with completely new eyes. And it begins, as so many surprising things do, in a place you would never expect. The first thing worth understanding about Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is who actually built it. Most audiences in 1968 sat down expecting a family musical and gave no particular thought to the names behind the camera. But those names told an entirely different story. The film was produced by Albert R. Cubby Broccoli, the man directly responsible for bringing James Bond to cinema screens around the world. Broccoli had spent years perfecting the craft of large-scale spectacle, learning how to translate enormous budgets into images that made audiences feel the full weight of what they were watching. When he turned his attention to a story about a flying car and an eccentric inventor, he brought every lesson from the spy world with him. Production designer Ken Adam, whose dramatic visual work had defined films like Goldfinger, was brought in to shape the look of the entire production. His instinct for theatrical grandeur and dramatic spatial design transformed what might have been a modest fantasy into something that looked genuinely monumental. The craftsmanship on screen was not that of a children's entertainment made on reasonable terms. It was the craftsmanship of a blockbuster action machine quietly redirected toward a very different kind of story. That ambition was shaped from the very beginning by a competition the filmmakers could not ignore. When producers began developing this project, the shadow of Mary Poppins fell across every meeting room and every budget discussion. Disney's 1964 masterpiece had become one of the most successful and beloved family films ever produced, and the people behind the production had decided, with considerable confidence, that they could match it. That decision shaped everything that followed. The budget rose to reflect the scale of what was being attempted. Dick Van Dyke, who had starred in Mary Poppins itself, was cast as a lead, making comparison not just implicit, but completely unavoidable. And in what remains one of the most direct acts of creative competition in Hollywood history, the Sherman brothers, Richard and Robert, who had written the songs for Mary Poppins, were hired again here, this time outside the Disney system entirely, to craft a score that could stand alongside their most celebrated work. The resulting songs gave the film its emotional backbone, its humor, and its most enduring moments of pure joy. Behind the songs, however, the path to a finished screenplay was considerably more complicated. Roald Dahl, already celebrated for darkly imaginative fiction that combined menace and humor in ways that no other writer quite managed, was brought in to write the script. His involvement seemed perfectly calibrated to the material. His instinct for edge, for stories that carried a genuine sting beneath their playful surface, appeared to be exactly what a film like this needed. The reality proved far more difficult. As the screenplay developed, Dahl's creative vision clashed repeatedly with the expectations of a major studio family production. His contributions were rewritten, softened, and reshaped to fit a more conventional mold. The collaborative pressures that shape every large-scale production gradually moved the story away from what he had intended. When the finished film reached audiences, Dahl made no effort to conceal his feelings. He expressed clear dissatisfaction with what had been done to the material, distancing himself from the final result with a directness that surprised nobody who knew him. Audiences loved the movie. Dahl, by most accounts, did not. The relationship between the film and its source material was itself a transformation so complete that Fleming's original work barely survives in recognizable form. Ian Fleming's novel was a slim, gentle adventure aimed at young readers, relatively light on menace, and entirely free of the elaborate fantasy world that dominates the film's second half. The filmmakers kept the family, kept the car, and kept the basic sense of wonder, then built an almost entirely new story around those elements. The fictional kingdom of Bulgaria, its tyrannical rulers, and the dark atmosphere of its underground world were all inventions of the screenplay. Characters with no equivalent in Fleming's pages were given major roles. Entire sequences were constructed from scratch to fill the runtime of what was being positioned as a road show-length musical spectacular. The result shares a title and a central image with its source material, while functioning as a largely independent creation. Fleming's novel remains a brief, warm tale for children. The film that carries its name is a 2.5-hour spectacle with its own mythology, its own internal logic, and its own surprisingly dark corners. The darkest of those corners belongs to a character who was never in the original story at all. The child catcher, that long-nosed, cape-draped figure who hunts children to the streets with a decorated carriage, exists nowhere in Fleming's novel. He was created specifically for the screen, and the credit for his invention is widely attributed to Dahl during the scripting process. The character was designed to embody a specific kind of dread quite different from the broadly comedic villainy found elsewhere in the film. Played with extraordinary physical menace by Robert Helpman, a ballet dancer whose control of his own body gave the performance a quality of movement that felt genuinely wrong. The child catcher became the image that stayed with audiences long after everything else had faded. The long nose, the dark costume, the false promises of sweets, and the slow, predatory patience his pursuit created something that felt ancient and deeply unsettling. Parents reported children refusing to return to cinemas. Multiple generations of viewers have carried a memory of this character into adulthood, and for many people the child catcher remains the most vivid thing about the entire film. What began as a screenplay addition to provide dramatic tension became production's most lasting psychological achievement. While the child catcher was frightening audiences in stalls, other illusions were playing out more quietly on screen. Among the more elegant deceptions in the film is the character of Grandpa Potts, who appears to be comfortably decades older than his inventor son. The performance is entirely convincing. The posture, the shuffle, the unfocused warmth of a man lost pleasantly inside his own world all land exactly as intended. Almost nobody watching suspects anything unusual. The secret is that Lionel Jeffries, who played the grandfather, was actually younger than Dick Van Dyke, who played his son. Van Dyke was in his early 40s during production. Jeffries was in his late 30s. The age gap between them ran in entirely the wrong direction for the roles they were playing, and achieving the illusion required careful makeup work, deliberate costuming choices, and performance from Jeffries built entirely on physical storytelling. There is no moment in the film where the illusion slips. It stands as one of the more elegant demonstrations of how fully committed performance, combined with skilled craft work, can make the camera believe something that simply is not true. The music that accompanied all of this illusion was itself the product of a remarkable creative independence. Richard and Robert Sherman had spent years at Disney crafting some of the most beloved songs in the history of family entertainment. Their work on Mary Poppins, The Jungle Book, and countless other productions had made them the most recognizable names in their field. This project represented one of their most significant ventures outside the studio system that had defined their careers. And the creative freedom that came of working independently produced a score full of the earworm melodies and theatrical energy that had always characterized their best work. The title song earned an Academy Award nomination and became one of their most enduring compositions. Across the full score, from the rollicking energy of Toot Sweets to the tender warmth of Hushabye Mountain, the music gave the film its emotional center. A story about an inventor, a flying car, and a kingdom of villains needed songs that could carry genuine weight, and the Shermans delivered something that has outlasted almost everything else about the production. Long before any of those songs reached an audience, the machine built to sell the film was already running at considerable speed. The distributors treated this not as a family picture hoping for a warm reception, but as a major cultural event requiring months of carefully orchestrated public attention. The marketing budget was substantial by any standard of the era, and the strategy reflected a confidence that the film needed to arrive with maximum noise. Promotional materials appeared across multiple platforms simultaneously. Posters, press coverage, radio spots, and tie-in merchandise were coordinated to build a sense of excitement that carried audiences from first awareness through to opening night. The car itself became a central promotional tool, appearing at public events and generating the kind of attention that money alone could not manufacture. It was a tangible, spectacular object that people could actually see and respond to, giving the campaign something most movie promotions entirely lack. When the film finally arrived in select engagements, It was presented with formality that reflected exactly how seriously its producers regarded it. Audiences heard an overture before the curtain rose, orchestral music setting the mood before a single image appeared on screen. An intermission divided the considerable runtime into two halves. Exit music played as the lights came up. Every element of the presentation was designed to communicate that this was not an ordinary trip to the cinema. The roadshow format placed a film in distinguished company alongside epics like Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, which had used the same presentation style to signal their cultural weight. For a family musical built around a flying car and a cast of eccentric characters, it was an ambitious framing that reflected how completely its creators believed in what they had made. The technical decisions behind production reinforced that ambition at every level. The cinematography was captured using 70mm large format equipment, a process that allowed far more visual information to be recorded on each frame than standard 35mm film could accommodate. The wide-open landscapes of the English countryside, the elaborate interiors of Bulgaria, and the sprawling musical numbers all benefited from a format that could hold their full scale without compression or loss of detail. The choice placed the film in technical conversation with the most ambitious productions of the era and projected onto the large screens of roadshow engagements. The images carried a clarity that justified every decision made to achieve it. Filming the musical sequences at that level of ambition required solutions that did not yet exist. Standard playback equipment of the era was often inadequate for open-air filming, where wind, distance, and ambient noise could make it nearly impossible for performers to hear the music they were supposed to be singing to. The crew developed solutions using powerful speaker arrays positioned around filming locations, ensuring that playback music reached every performer clearly regardless of where the camera was pointing or how large the staging area happened to be. The engineering effort behind these sequences rarely receives the recognition given to performances themselves, but what audiences see as effortless charm was supported by an invisible technical infrastructure of considerable sophistication. The production's commitment to controlled visual beauty extended into choices that most filmmakers would never consider. For certain visually stylized sequences, the team made the decision to repaint trees in the filming area to bring their coloring in line with the specific palette the designers had chosen. Props were adjusted, surfaces were altered, and backgrounds were dressed to maintain a consistent visual language across every shot. The result was a frame that looked less like a film location and more like an illustration brought carefully to life. In a film built around fantasy and wonder, the decision to paint trees rather than simply film them was entirely consistent with the philosophy driving every other creative choice. Nothing within the frame was permitted to be accidental. Not everything went according to plan. Dick Van Dyke suffered a leg injury during production that forced the crew to rethink how and when certain scenes could be filmed. Scenes requiring physical performance or extended movement had to be postponed or reorganized, and the schedule was restructured around what Van Dyke could physically manage at various points in his recovery. The crew worked extended hours across multiple weeks to recover lost time, and the fact that the finished film shows no visible trace of any disruption is itself a quiet achievement. The audience sees only the seamless result, with no hint of the considerable scramble that produced it. Behind some of the film's most convincing environments lay transformations just as complete. The exterior and interior spaces representing the scrumptious family home were filmed at Pinewood Studios in Buckinghamshire, one of the most storied production facilities in British cinema history. Working within the studio gave the crew precise control over lighting, camera placement, and set dressing that a real historic property could never have offered. The architecture could be adjusted, and the entire visual presentation of the house could be managed to serve the story rather than accommodate the limitations of an actual building. Audiences see a convincing world of Edwardian elegance that feels entirely real, built from craft and control rather than genuine stone and history. The car at the center of all of it was not, in fact, a single object. The magical vehicle that audiences saw driving, flying, and sailing across a 2.5-hour runtime was actually a collection of 6 purpose-built machines, each designed to handle specific requirements that no single vehicle could have managed alone. The principal road-going car was built to be driven on public roads. Separate versions were constructed for flying sequences, designed to be rigged and suspended without needing to perform any real automotive function. Others were built specifically for water sequences, configured to float rather than drive. Production designer Ken Adam approached the vehicle not as a prop, but as a character requiring its own visual arc and its own capacity to generate feeling in an audience. The design combined the elegance of Edwardian motoring with elements of pure fantasy, sweeping wings and gleaming brass fittings, suggesting something that had always been capable of flight rather than something that had merely been modified to achieve it. The challenge of maintaining perfect visual consistency across 6 entirely different functional objects was considerable, and the fact that most audiences remain completely unaware that multiple cars existed is the clearest measure of how successfully that challenge was met. Getting those cars into the air convincingly required someone who understood not just the mechanics of practical effects, but the specific grammar of cinematic illusion. The effects work was led by John Steers, whose credentials place him at the center of some of the most technically ambitious British filmmaking of the period. His experience on the Bond productions, where he developed a reputation for solving problems that had no established solutions, translated directly to the challenge of making a large, heavy, entirely earthbound object appear to fly credibly across an extended runtime. The techniques his team employed combined large-scale rigging, carefully controlled camera work, and the optical compositing methods of the era to create sequences that held up across multiple viewings. Steers would go on to lead effects work on the original Star Wars, bringing the same problem-solving instinct to a production that would redefine audience expectations entirely. His work here was an early demonstration of exactly what made him exceptional. The optical effect of the era left traces that modern eyes can clearly detect. Edges carry a faint luminosity, and the boundary between a film's subject and its background glows slightly in ways that real photography never produces. In most films of the period, these artifacts were considered imperfections to be minimized. In this production, something more interesting happened. The slight unreality created by the compositing process aligned almost perfectly with the visual language of illustrated children's books, the world from which the story had originally come. A flying car suspended against the painted sky, surrounded by that gentle glow of optical combination, looked less like a failed attempt at realism and more like a beautifully produced storybook brought carefully into motion. Limitations that might have undermined a different kind of film became, in this context, a quiet and effective artistic asset. The film's final cost reached approximately $10 million, an enormous sum for a family musical in 1968, and a figure that placed it among the most expensive British productions of the decade. The initial theatrical run performed respectably, but fell short of the kind of overwhelming returns that would have made the gamble look obviously correct in retrospect. Over time, however, the picture found its audience through repeat viewings, television broadcasts, and home video, building the enduring commercial legacy that its original theatrical release had only partially established. The gamble ultimately paid off, but it required a patience that not everyone involved in the original investment had anticipated needing. The cars that were built simply to be filmed have since become among the most recognized automotive objects in the world. The original road-going hero vehicle has passed through several owners since production wrapped, with auction appearances producing sale prices reaching into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Museum exhibitions in both the United Kingdom and internationally have given the surviving cars a second life as objects of display, allowing audiences who never saw the film in its original release to encounter the physical reality of what they had previously known only from a screen.